Hello, this is Al Black with Chewing the Gristle and my co-host Tim Conroy. Hi, Tim.
My brother Al, how you doing today?
Oh, great. I walked outside. The sun is out for the first time in a couple days. Yes. And today our poet is Ann-Chadwell Humphries. Welcome, Ann.
Hello, brothers, my brothers.
Ann-Chadwell Humphries lives in Columbia, South Carolina. She has written almost 200 poems and essays, featured in regional literary journals, a juried chapbook, and on city buses. She's won several poetry contests, an Emerging Voice Award, and a writing scholarship. Muddy Ford Press selected Ann for their laureate series and published her first book of poems.
Eclipse and A Butcher.
And tell us about your early experience with poetry, your education with poetry, your early influences, and how did it first find you?
When I was a girl in rural Texas, our family lived in rural Texas on what had been a 2,000-acre ranch and had been converted to a camp. And we were 13 miles outside of town, and the little school there was first grade, didn't have kindergarten then, first grade through 12th grade, with a total of 210 students. So my classes often were 10 people, maybe 12, sometimes 8 as they got older. And the reason I'm saying that is our school is a 1A school, and we competed in I competed in poetry recitation and as a girl, and it was a big deal. So my classmates, we had to compete to represent the school, and then we did the regional, and Texas was the one that originated what's called the University Interscholastic League. There was also music appreciation, art appreciation, reading, writing essays, debate, extemporaneous speaking. I found it foundational. We were given some poems from which to pick, which elementary school kids could recite pretty well. And the standard, The Village Blacksmith, House by the Side of the Road. Actually, I did Renascence by Edna St. Vincent Millay one time. Anyway, my girlhood friends and I still talk about it. But we dressed up, and I, nice church shoes and socks and dresses, and we would ride at least 30 miles on the bus through the canyons of the hill country to Rocksprings, to Knippa, to Camp Wood, these tiny Harper. People can look that up in the hill country, and these tiny little, but we competed and we were serious. So that's not what I would say is my foundation. And our family always had books around. We were fortunate and played pretty music. One of my favorite books is the 101 Best Poems. Now, there are many poem books by that name, but those slim little, poetry books are little tiny power stations. They're little tiny, and they just pack so much into it. So we would pull those out for family gatherings and pass it around and read excerpts from like the Declaration of Independence. And so we're kind of a storytelling family. That was my first encounter. And I did compete in high school. When we moved to Austin, I would be in 9th grade, and I did compete in Austin, but it's different. It was so big, but I still competed.
That 101 famous poems, I have my mother's dog-eared copy.
Oh my.
And that's where I first read poetry. And my mother had a bunch of them memorized.
Yes. Did you have the oval pictures, the black and white pictures of the poets?
Some of them, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Tim.
And in this moment of COVID and political chaos, how has it impacted your writing? how have you been able to prepare your spirit and your soul to continue to write?
Writing, I have been writing a lot of new poems. Of course, this fall and summer has been very much involved in the production of the book, the editing, the close contact with the editor, Ed Madden, close contact with USC Writing Center, Christina Zan. And it's been such a privilege. And to me, writing poetry is my way of saying something to the world. To me, it's a form of worship, form of prayer, a form of clarification, holding myself accountable. And it has galvanized me to do more. I don't necessarily write contemporary poems, although I can, or political poems. I don't write those kinds of poems at this point. I did write one on Dylan Roof, and there's some others that are more political, but those were early. But probably like both of you, it's foundational. It's a way of meditation and drawing close to what it is in us, spirit, and it's the spirit that we share with everybody, and goodness that isn't the engine for all of us. So that's how I've kind of cocooned myself in poetry too, staying with beauty, limiting my media diet severely because I can't take it. And I've written some very good poems. I've written some really nice poems, which are new poems starting to enter into contests.
Sister Ann, how would you describe your poetry style?
You know, I don't know, Tim. What do you think? My friends tell me that I have developed a voice. I am more confident in how I write. I love form. I write a lot in form. I write a lot in free verse. But as you well know, and I really sincerely, it's a gift of blindness. I've had incredible things happen to me. I no longer see with my eyes. I see with my whole being, my skin, my memory, my organization, my attention, my listening. My Susan Craig and Betsy Thorne said, Ann, your voice is really coming out. And I'm not quite sure what that means, but I feel more confident in what I'm writing and paring away what is not essential in the poem. And Ed taught me that. Didn't you find that when you were working with him? He gave my poems as the first poet, as the first in the laureate series. It was a master class, and he's such a kind, knowledgeable person. We did it all by email, just like you did. Very little, hardly any. It's all electronic, back and forth. And there were times when I staggered and lost my confidence in it during the process. But he said, Ann, don't second guess yourself. You're doing a good job. And he would just do little praiseworthy things, say a few things that kept me going. What do you think my voice is?
Well, I think your poetry style, I would say, is, you invoke so much feeling. So I almost would say it's more lyrical than narrative, but although you do have some narrative poems. So, I think you do use form when you want the poem to be sort of contained in a form, to experiment with the form. But instead of talking about it, let's hear a couple of your poems.
I'll start with the first poem in the book. A portrait in bronze of the eclipse. We had not expected metallic light, bunched as we were in solar glasses, opened our arms to it, beseeching it as if we could catch the color like drops of rain or hold a robin with both hands. But the light would not be contained. It casts shadows crisp as shadow lines. Ripples skittered over our shoes and across the sand. And the air softened like night. And as it did, clouds rouged the horizon. And then it was gone. So I wrote that poem.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful.
Thank you. I wrote that poem as part of the Syzygy contest, which Jasper and One Columbia and Poet Laureate Ed put together for the August 2017 Eclipse. And I wrote several Eclipse poems, which is so much fun to research. And Ed picked 3 of them to anchor the book. Of course, the title, An Eclipse and a Butcher. I'll come back to that in a little bit. I'll recite another poem that is, I guess, lyrical. But that's lyrical, isn't it? It's the second or third. And this one's called Baptisms. His family straight as stalks fix their eyes on him like sunflowers follow the sun. Dressed in white, short pants, long socks, he peeked over the pleated shoulder of the black robe, canted his eyes from parents to pastor, who dampened his hair 3 times, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. After the service, I stepped into the light of his mother's smile to pat his back, and he reached for me, curled a dimpled arm around my neck, pressed the pedal of his ear to my cheek, and it was I who was anointed.
Let's move to the idea of revision.
Yeah.
How much revision do you do? And is a poem ever really finished?
I make it finished. Sometimes it isn't, but here's something that in writing, since we're talking poets and kind of how we write and why we write, I work a lot with revisions, of course. Ed gave several of my poems really tight haircuts, but he told me that some of my work was preamble. He said, don't throw that away. That's still good work. But here is the heart of the poem to him. And he did say something in a review that I was good at revising. I'm not afraid to revise. But what I was going to tell you is I enroll in the Richland Library Reading Challenge, and I've done that for several summers, and it helps me do something or make a project. So I use that to collect the inventory of my poems, and so I could keep up with them. So to your revision question, so I went back to some of those poems and worked to maybe update them with the skills that I have now, which I didn't have at that time. And there's one poor poem, which is just a wonderful poem for the Anne of that time. But I felt like I just gave it plastic surgery. It was all stitched up and I almost ruined it from trying to revise it. So I tell myself those poems are Anne, those are Anne of that time and Anne of this time. Now, if there's something pretty obvious, just as a matter of fact, yesterday we were kind of clipping out some participles and ands and a's from a poem we entered in a contest. Sometimes you have to leave it alone, as you well know. You just have to leave it alone and let it season like stew. You know that. And then come back around and it talks to you. The poems talk to you, don't they? They kind of tell you what to do. Now, sometimes when you're in a deadline, you've got to rush that process, like with the book. But I'm not afraid to revise. And I have a couple of writing groups, and we read the poems to each other, read and critique. So I get good critiques and make adjustments. And we all know that's what we want to adjust. We don't have to accept everything, what we adjust. Isn't that how you all do it?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah, and
Reading
sometimes,
aloud helps.
yeah, and I love writing groups. You know, it really
Mhm.
helps me a lot. And so, you know, that's, to me, that's important for any emerging poet to do, is to find their group of trusted poets.
Now, it took me a while because I knew you all had your group, and the groups are rightly closed. Our book club invites guests, but not regular members because, and there was a time when we invited a couple of guests, but you know, I'm respectful that some groups are closed. But, and I tried to get some other groups together, and it was at a Poetry Society of South Carolina workshop. I brought a guest and I was telling her about it, that I haven't been able to find a group. So she said, say the words in the group. So I said, Fred Deans was teaching it. And I took a breath and I said, I'm looking for a poetry partner. If any of you would like to compare poetry and write, contact me. And not immediately, but Delia Corrigan, who's a wonderful poet, came around and said, you were so brave to have done that. That tells me a lot about who you are. Let's write. And so she and I take online classes through the University of Iowa, University of Pennsylvania. She was my note taker for an in-person class at the university. And then I discovered someone I knew a long time ago, that she wrote poetry. And it, you know, it just kind of clicks. And these are not big groups. These are just onesie twosie kinds of group, maybe 3, maybe 4. But I sure rely on them now. And they ask good questions. They say, what did you mean by that? Or I paused at this part. But that's how poetry groups evolved for me.
That's wonderful. Can you share a couple more poems with us?
All right. This is the third one of the first 3. 3 Dreams. In 1960s Kodachrome, 3 sisters, less than 3 years apart, sit cross-legged, unself-conscious, hair tousled, streaked with sun, play clothes strewn across their chests. One squints, puts her elbow on her knee. The second shades her face, and the third sits straight back, blue eyes wide with surprise. 3 sisters, tossed in the air by their father, scramble into a bubbled bath to crowd the tub. One by one, hoisted by their mother, toweled dry. Sisters, hair fragrant with soap, giggle into gowns before supper and stories. Tucked in one bed, loose-limbed, shallowed breaths, curl from each other to dream, dreams that one day must pull them apart. That's, of course, tribute to the sisters. Thank you. I had to come to terms that we were across topographies. Tim, would you read Winter Orange?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
I asked him to read this because I have the word topography and time zones in this poem, and my sisters were in 3 different time zones, and our families were growing, and then we're getting grandchildren, and there was not sister time. And I'm here in South Carolina. My family now is all back in Texas, in the San Antonio, Austin area. One sister had been in California, Minnesota, Philadelphia, but I felt crowded out. I think they did too. I mean, we had other responsibilities. So this is a tribute to that. And those pictures are true. There's the picture of the 3 of us sitting in the sun, and then there's a picture of us in the bed, and we're we are curled apart. My hair was all up. Soundly sleeping.
This is Winter Orange in memory of Sarah Scruggs. From her breakfast table, she stares out the south window. Bare branches reveal her neighbor's deck. Their forgotten mop leans against a tilted bucket. Before her, the pepper mill sits half full, salt crust on the shaker, paper napkins prim in their basket. She glances at her cookbook collection, noting her favorites, the frayed bindings taped for another new year, another new year. The solstice sun slants further unto her gingham cloth, first bright from the east, then high midday, lengthening from the west, the shadows sweep clockwise around wrought iron candlesticks. Absently, she smooths the pathology report. Ink stains her fingertips. The words bounce wild in her mind. Hounds trail her fear as she crashes through briars in territory unknown, desperate for escape. But I, the winter orange, call to her. I travel topographies and time zones to rest in her fluted bowl. To her I say, hold me with both hands. Behold my rich color. When you pierce my skin, I anoint you. Inhale. Let my fragrance calm you. Let my shaggy threads weave hope in your heart. Let me leathery core, pliant and strong, center you, and my cool, sweet juice nourish you. Come to me, choose me, accept my blessing. After a time, she rises from her table, reaches for her apron, and the rest of her life. Yeah, what an ending.
That's a lyric poem, isn't it? Huh.
Well, I think it kind of is both, right? It's narrative because there's a story there. And it's lyrical because it invokes so much feeling with your imagery.
As a poet, who are you reading? Who's fueling your imagination now?
I listen to poetry podcasts a lot. And as a matter of fact, the Academy of American Poets had a new one, and they're all different titles. I listen to Daily Poem. I really like that one. Poetry Unbound. I like that one. Of course, for the New Yorker when it comes on, but it's not as frequent. But there's one that just came out this summer from the Academy of American Poets. Maybe it's Poem a Day. And it's voiced, I think, by the staff of the Academy. I'm not sure, but the names are uncommon names to what you usually hear. The voices are young, and they're older voices too. They're voices with Hispanic accents and Spanish, voices with Asian source poets, East Indian. And I have a nice friend who knows them. So I just wrote a thank you note to her and asked her to forward it to the Academy because I didn't know to whom to send it. And complimenting that we were hearing more voices, new voices. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. And I'm also listening to Ted Kooser again. I've read the books, Delights and Shadows, which won the Pulitzer. I probably read that 50 times. And the Poetry Home Repair Manual was a textbook in a class my friend Susan Craig took with Mickey Finney. That's a great read. That's on my list right now.
Wonderful. Because we don't create in vacuums. Thank you.
Yeah, and let's dig into the craft, your poetry craft. what are the poetic elements you tend to use, and which ones do you tend to avoid?
Well, memory is an element, and it's an honor, and people compliment me on the visual descriptions that I present. And I guess since I still have visual memory, I have visual memory. And I've also tapped into so many other senses. There are more than 5 senses, for Pete's sakes. There's a sense of attention. There's a sense of course, touch is one of the standard 5, but there are a variety of ways you sense touch. Touch is where I live these days. Hearing is where I live. And I know to add color. I try to add color and sound in my poems. Something textural, something oral. I do keep those in mind when I write. For example, the poem in the An Artist's Friend, there's a 1918 Eclipse. It's a longer poem, but it's an artist who's scratching out his interpretation of what the eclipse was. That's an example. I also just the craft. Here's my Bluetooth keyboard. Can you see it?
Yes.
So it's the process to make it easy. So you see my bump dots. Y'all know this, but people who don't know me. So I see shards of light now. It's a genetic disease. It's a rogue disease. It doesn't hurt. It came a long time and I could prepare for it. And I just crossed over into the blind. I can say that word, the B word, blind. But anyway, so I have, fortunately, I can afford the iPad and the iPhone and 2 keyboards, which I type on. And my phone talks to me. Okay. Okay.
Friday. Do not disturb. Press home to open. Button.
I can change the speed.
Address. Use an assistive reload. Button.
I can change the speed and the voice, of course. How much punctuation is conveyed? Some, none, all. And I can read it by character, by word, by line, by paragraph. And that helps me find where the line breaks are. When I read other people's poems, I'll pass that back to you. So that is kind of the physical craft. I like to write sitting outside. I think I took a class with Nikki Finney, and she said, don't be prim, I'm paraphrasing, about where you write. You can get locked into, and then you won't write if you're not in that place. So exercise your composition muscle. Memory is a very strong, as I mentioned. So I've taken myself to poetry camp several summers in a row. And Kirk and I, our family is grown. Our sons have families of their own now. So we downsized into patio home. And there are little nooks in this home and the little courtyard in the back. And I move around, and the front porch is covered front porch. It's small, but it's like a vest pocket porch. So I move around in those places. And I think the change in scenery and sound in what is that N word, instruct my work. And the craft, Ed has taught me some new things about craft. For example, he, in the book, 9 Days, he put together 9 haikus into one poem. And that poem is the one that Naomi Shihab Nye, who was the Chancellor of American Poet, read. And he also put together 3 historic poems. One I wrote about the Irish canal diggers, the Camp Sorghum, the Confederate Union POW across the river, across this Saluda in the Civil War. And then Harriet Tubman I wrote about because the newly discovered portrait of her as a young woman. So one way of craft is paying attention. I wrote a poem, Kite Boy from Bangladesh, which did make it in the book. And that was based on a radio interview that just captivated me. So I hope that's part of what my answer is.
Are there resources or practices, or you've talked some about your practices, especially changing the location of where you're sitting, or books, resources or books that you recommend that help you with your writing of poetry?
Well, I mentioned the Poetry Home Repair Manual. What helps me is when I enroll in the university classes. I'm hopeful to enroll in one this coming spring because Nikki Finney is teaching it, and it's an undergraduate class. So I took my first class with Nikki Finney, a graduate poetry class. That was phenomenal. Then I did an independent study with Ed Madden and two friends. And then I signed up with Tara Powell for Southern poetry after World War II. She's a Southern Studies professor and poet in the English department. And then this spring, Fred Dings. You know, I'm over the speed limit and I don't have to pay tuition. So I can get in for like a $50 technology fee. And I put myself in positions to learn. I put myself in positions to succeed. I've attended the Hub City workshop twice, but that's where I met Jessica Jacobs and Nicole Brown, who wrote a quote on the back of the book. They were phenomenal teachers, and their voices were so strong. Then Marjorie Wentworth did the third quote on the back of the book, and she's just been so incredible. 17 years poet laureate for South Carolina, fearless. And I took a workshop with her at the state library. I remember her prompts. My resources are the newspaper. If I can't find it, I'm a member of Talking Books, which is through the state library and the Library of Congress. And they'll get resources for me. As a matter of fact, they found a kind of an obscure book of poetry, which I was allowed to keep. It was on, it's not Zimborska, but it's a book of illuminated things, a book of luminous things. And I've learned from that book, it's just short poems, how to write shorter poems. And pack them. That's a skill, don't you think? To write a shorter poem takes a lot of time.
That's my brother, the poet Al Black, is a really just magical with concision in short poems.
Mm-hmm.
I marvel at his ability with that. But Ann, can you tell us how the listeners can get hold of your book?
Yes, thank you for asking. They can visit my website. Muddy Ford Press gave me permission for this. www.Ann-Chadwell Humphries. That's my poetry name, Ann-Chadwell. Ann-ChadwellHumphries.com. And you can purchase one there for a signed, personalized, embossed copy. Let's see a book.
Yeah.
Because I signed my name embossed. Can you see that's embossed? So it's tactile for me. And we put Braille fonts, by the way, in my website. You can't feel them, but it makes people aware. This is my embosser. That's kind of different. They can get it from Hub City bookstore, and they can get it from Amazon, online, and Barnes and Noble. And if you get it that way, that's free shipping. But it's the bare book. So thank you so much for asking. Thank you for letting me be part of this incredible year-long project.
Is there a last thing you would like to say to the emerging poet of any age?
I would like to speak and to say writing poetry is the means to a meaningful life. Writing and reading poetry, you don't have to write poetry, but to read it. And it is through the writing of it and the reading of it that, to me, the world, the universe opens. The poetry holds me accountable for the kind of person I want to be. It helps develop me. And I can't live without it now. It's a practice. It's a part of my routine, and I schedule time for it. So I wish all of you would have the courage to go for it. And you'll start with poems that are kind of primitive. Who cares? You get to getting something on paper and out of your head. And I would also say the poetry community is a very welcoming community in our area. It's over the years through to the mayor's office, One Columbia, Ed being the poet laureate of Columbia, has really built a wonderful foundation of welcome and challenge for us to experiment and stretch our wings. So that's how I would like to leave it. Poetry is fundamental.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful interview with our friend and poet, Ann-Chadwell Humphries. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Al and Tim, and let's have a good new year.